He always kept his face pressed to the wall whenever anyone entered the service corridor. The house staff learned to tiptoe when the boy was there, to talk in low voices, and to avoid the corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. It was a peculiar habit for the son of a billionaire, a boy who moved through rooms that could swallow whole lives. People tried to joke about it. People made excuses. But when the new maid arrived, she did the thing no one else dared. She asked him why. The maid had hands like a gardener's and eyes that had mapped hardship into quiet strength. She had been hired for honesty, not for tact, and she carried a calm that made bosses confess small secrets. She found him with his forehead to the plaster, breathing in the silence as if it were something he needed like air. She did not knock. She did not call for permission. She set a basket of folded linens at his feet and asked, plain and steady, why he kept hiding his face. He flinched like a man disturbed in prayer. For a moment he did not answer. The corridor felt longer than it should. The faint hum of the house sounded like hundreds of lives happening without him. Then, almost inaudible, he whispered 3 words that sounded more like a confession than anything. Those 3 words would change the way she saw him, but they were wrapped in decades of context the maid did not yet know. The boy was not rude. He was not stubborn. He was more like a wounded animal that had learned how to survive in a garden that wasn't built for him. The owner of the house had made his fortune with sleek hands and sharper deals. He had little patience for discipline that interfered with profit, and he controlled everything with contracts, with schedules, with a brand of order that believed money could purchase absolution. The son had been raised in this order, taught how to smile for cameras, how to sit politely at charity dinners, how to recite the names of donors whose faces he had never seen. But something in him did not fit the glass and steel world. He retreated to plaster and silence. In the beginning, people assumed it was a childhood whim, a quirk that would be outgrown. Tutors were called, doctors were consulted. Behavioral specialists visited and left notes in careful language. None of it stuck. He would answer politely at dinners, then retreat to the corridor to press his face to the cold wall. Sometimes he would hum under his breath, a melody that belonged to no famous composer. Sometimes he pressed his ear to the plaster as if listening for someone on the other side. The maid sat on the step opposite him and did not pull away when he leaned back and allowed his head to rest against her knee. There was something about that motion, a gesture so small, so human, that admitted the boy was not a puzzle to be solved with money. The maid wiped her hands on her apron and listened. After a while he spoke, and the words were soft as if he feared the house would overhear. His voice had the texture of rehearsed apologies. He told her about nights in his room, about photographs tucked away in drawers, about letters he would not show anyone. He said that walls told stories. He believed, with the earnest fervor of the young, that walls absorbed conversation and kept echoes safe. If he pressed his face to the plaster, he could sometimes hear laughter and whispers and a memory that did not belong to the present. But the truth was something else entirely. The reason he kept hiding his face was not to find echoes, it was to hide from a smell. Not the clean, antiseptic smell of the mansion, but a human smell that made him freeze, the smell of his mother's perfume. The scent carried memories too sharp to hold. He would breathe in and the house would tilt, the polished floors dissolving into a small kitchen with chipped enamel pots, a woman in worn slippers, and the steady rhythm of someone who made a life out of small acts of care. The maid did not expect such tenderness to live in him. She had expected petulance, entitlement, maybe a rehearsed cruelty. Instead she found tenderness like a thin thread and decided to pull. She asked if he wanted to tell her more. He hesitated, then glanced at the family portraits that lined the corridor, stiff smiles, tuxedos, orchestrated poses. For a fleeting second, those faces looked like strangers. When he whispered the 3 words to her, she thought at first he meant he was too young to know himself. He said, "I am not mine." The meaning deepened as he spoke. His life had been controlled, negotiated, and ransacked in his name. His body had become a brand asset. His laughter had been scheduled. Even his grief had been managed by publicists. The maid's response was a silence heavy with gravity. She had worked for families where kindness and closeness were carefully guarded. Now she sat with a boy whose life had been claimed by someone else's ambition, and she realized the softness that comes from honest poverty, an authenticity that money cannot fabricate. Over the next weeks their exchanges became the quiet backbone of something new. The boy would hide in cupboards and closets and the maid would find him, sometimes with crumbs in his hair from pilfered pastries, sometimes with damp eyes from watching old home movies stolen from the attic. She began to bring small things, a hard candy from the corner store, a second-hand comic she had bought for a niece. He treasured these private gifts like contraband. Word inside the house moved as it always does. Staff whispered that the maid had softened the boy. The housekeeper claimed she was meddling. The owner noticed that his son's public appearances were less automatic, that sometimes the boy would turn away from cameras and look toward the kitchen with a hesitance the owner mistook for shyness. Discussions were held with consultants. The father suggested fewer public events, or a more rigorous routine. The boy's face in public remained a mask, the house a stage. Nobody listened when the boy started to refuse the brand photos. He refused a staged handshake with a politician. He would make some polite show of compliance and then retire to press his face against the wall. The father answered in the only language he understood: more control. He arranged for tutors, for a stricter staff rota, for increased security. The house became like a fortress with a child at its center who refused to be consumed. The maid, meanwhile, had her own quiet defiance. She refused to keep the boy at a distance. She saw his eyes soften when someone was simply willing to sit with him. She saw how laughter returned in thin, hesitant streams when someone asked him about the music he hummed. She taught him to listen to his own voice, to name small pleasures that weren't part of his father's brand. She taught him that walls were not prisons even when they held pain. They could be witnesses, porous things that held memory but not fate. They began to share stories. The maid told of mornings when she would wake before dawn to sweep, of the smell of bread cooking in a neighborhood far from the mansion, of a brother who had taught her to read by covering the pages with his hands and asking her to guess the words. The boy told of black suits and empty compliments, of being praised for a smile he had not chosen. Sometimes they sat in the pantry eating stale biscuits and watched the house like two small islands observing a fleet. Then one afternoon the father raised the stakes. A magazine was coming, a cover that would show the son as the heir apparent, a feature that would tout his philanthropic plan. The father wanted absolute compliance. He called the boy into his office, an austere room with a view that turned the sky into a commodity. He spoke in the voice of someone who believed legacy could be engineered. He told the boy that a family needed a face and a face must perform. The boy listened, fingers worrying at the edge of his sleeve. He excused himself. On his way out he paused in the hallway where the maid stood polishing silverware. He looked at her and something in his gaze was decisive. He did not say, "Please." He did not beg. He whispered those three words again, the ones that always came out when he could not bear the theater of his life: "I am not mine." This time the maid understood that those words were a demand. She pressed her palm to his shoulder and for the first time she did something braver than listening. She led him out of the house, past roses kept too perfect, into a narrow street where the air tasted of frying onions and human speech. They stopped at a small cafe the size of a storybook. The boy had never noticed such a place existed. He hesitated at the bell above the door, then stepped inside. He learned what it meant to be anonymous there, listened to people whose names mattered little and whose stories mattered a lot. He smelled coffee brewed by someone who liked the act of making it. He felt the world outside the glass and steel bubble as if he had been wearing blinders his whole life and someone had finally removed them. For a time the father raged. He threatened consequences. He spoke of contracts and obligations and the convenience of influence. He demanded the boy be returned. He tried to force the boy back into the orbit that had defined him. The house's staff quaked on the edge of loyalty, torn between wages and compassion. But the boy had tasted something he could not return from. He had tasted his own voice in the cacophony, the unsponsored version of himself. He started to question philanthropic plans that looked good on paper but never asked whether the people they helped wanted the things they were given. He asked why the foundation did not fund little cafes and after-school classes that actually fed curiosity. He asked why the face of the charity could not be the people it aimed to help. The father's strategy turned petty. He cut allowances, scheduled an intense regimen of public duties, tried replacing the maid with younger staff who would keep him in line. He offered new privileges and tried to coerce compliance with the blunt instrument of wealth. People watched to see if the boy would crack. Tabloids ran headlines about a troubled heir. Social media cheered when the son posted a rehearsed photo with a practiced smile. But the boy found dignity in small rebellions. He refused to like certain posts. He would slip away mid-event and call the maid, who had learned the contours of his fears. She would meet him at the back door with a thermos of soup and a ridiculous joke. They traded recipes and memories, and the boy began to read books that were not biographies of tycoons but histories of people who had built movements from streets and kitchens. The turning point came when an event required him to speak to donors about a new project. He could have recited the prepared lines. He could have offered the expected metric-driven talk. Instead he surprised everyone. He asked the audience a simple question: who are we helping? He spoke of listening first. He spoke of asking people what they needed and not assuming. He spoke about dignity and about giving space for people to be authors of their own stories. His words were blunt and human. They were not polished into a press release. Cameras caught the tremor in his voice. The father watched from the wings with a face that had always been equal parts pride and calculation. Some donors were pleased. Some were upset. The board debated. But the boy kept going. After the speech, as the crowd dispersed, the boy walked into the service corridor and, without ceremony, pressed his forehead to the wall. The maid found him and waited. He breathed deep and then he said the three words again, but this time they landed like something else. He said, "I am not mine, not yet." There was hope in the sentence like sunlight through storm clouds. The father eventually softened in ways money could not script. There were apologies that were awkward and honest, attempts to listen that did not feel like editorial meetings. The boy negotiated a new role, not as a packaged heir but as someone who would spend time on the ground, who would undo certain programs and fund others, who would learn to let the people affected speak for themselves. He hired staff from the very neighborhoods the foundation served. He started small initiatives that were messy and human. The maid kept working in the house but also kept a small photo of the boy taped inside a notebook, a reminder of a face that once needed the wall and no longer pressed for refuge. Sometimes she would find him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, learning to chop onions the way his mother might have. He would laugh at the sting and she would remind him of the joke they had shared in the cafe. One night the father found his son standing in the corridor with his face turned toward the light of an open window, not toward the wall. He did not hide anymore. He still had moments of retreat. Everyone does, but the habit of pressing himself into plaster had become less frequent. When the father asked why, the son smiled and said, "Because I taught myself to be present." And sometimes, when the house was quiet and the world felt too loud, the boy would walk to the wall and whisper the three words, not as surrender but as a claim. "I am not mine yet," he would say, then add, with a grin that made the house feel impossibly large, "but I'm working on it."